Dust Creek sat like a wound in the heart of the desert. Once, it had been a hopeful place, a pit stop for travelers, a trading post for ranchers, a speck of promise between the canyons. But the years had bleached that hope out of it. Now, the town was little more than splintered wood and silence, its few remaining souls clinging to life like weeds along a dry riverbed. The sun had no mercy here. It baked the red clay streets until they cracked like old skin. When the wind came, it carried the hiss of sand and the faint rattle of snakes moving through sagebrush. Even the church bell had gone silent, rusted in its tower like it had lost faith. They said nothing truly lived in Dust Creek except memories, and maybe ghosts. The whispers began again that summer, first among the ranchers who passed through for supplies, then at the saloon where fear was poured in every drink. They said the wind carried his name sometimes, Elias Kane, the deadliest gun the frontier had ever seen, the man who could shoot the ash off a cigarette at 50 yards, the legend who vanished after the Holloway gang betrayed him on the edge of the Rio Santo Canyon. They said Mace Holloway shot him, left him for dead, and took everything, the gold, the town, and the fear. Mace had been young then. Now he ruled Dust Creek like a rattler guarding its den. He and his gang Carver, the Dodd brothers, and lanky Wes Finn, rode rush-out over the town. They taxed every rancher, took every herd crossing, and collected tribute from the saloon, the store, even the church if a soul dared to pray too loud. Folks learned not to speak unless spoken to, not to look a Holloway man in the eye unless they wanted a fight they'd never win. The town had long since stopped believing in heroes. Until that night. It was dusk when the rider appeared, just a dark shape against the dying sun, trailing dust behind him like smoke. The horizon burned orange, and his silhouette cut through it, tall and straight-backed. His coat was long and weathered, the kind that had seen too many miles and too many winters. His horse was a big gray, ribs showing, but steady and quiet under him. When he reached the edge of town, he slowed, taking in the crooked saloon sign, the sagging porches, and the faces that peered from behind curtains. He dismounted slow, boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud that echoed in the empty street. The stranger tied his horse to the post outside the saloon, brushed dust from his coat, and pushed through the swinging doors. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke, and fear pretending to be laughter. A piano played off-key in the corner until it stopped when the doors creaked open. Every head turned. He didn't speak, just stood there a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the lamplight. They were gray, cold, and unreadable, like the sky before a storm. He walked to the bar, his spurs whispering against the floorboards. "Whiskey," he said. The barkeep, a thin man with hollows under his eyes, poured without question. He slid the glass across, and the stranger caught it, steady as stone. He drank once, slow and quiet, eyes drifting across the room. There were 4 men at the poker table in the corner. The way their hands froze told everyone what they were. Holloway's men. One of them, a thick-necked brute named Carver, leaned back in his chair. "Well, I'll be damned. Ain't seen your face in Dust Creek before. You lost, stranger." The man didn't look at him. He just set the glass down and said, "No." Carver smirked, pushing his chair back. "You sure? Lot of folks end up lost out here, especially if they don't pay their respects to the man who keeps this town running." The barkeep stiffened. "Carver, let him drink. He ain't both there and nobody." Carver's grin widened, showing yellow teeth. "I'm just being friendly." He turned to the stranger again. "You heard of Mace Holloway, old man?" "I've heard," the stranger said. "Then you know you owe him a drink," Carver said. "Ain't that right, boys?" The others chuckled. The stranger's hand moved just slightly, resting beside his glass. "If Holloway wants a drink, he can come collect it himself." The room froze. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, listening. Carver's smile faltered for the first time. He opened his mouth to speak, but something in the stranger's eyes stopped him. There was no threat in them, only certainty. The kind of look a man had when he'd already measured your grave. Carver muttered something under his breath and backed away to his chair. The piano started again, though the tune stumbled. The barkeep leaned closer as he refilled the glass. You best move on, mister. Holloway don't take kindly to strangers, especially ones that don't kneel. The stranger gave a faint nod. I ain't here to kneel. The barkeep hesitated, then lowered his voice. You talk like you know him. The man didn't answer. His eyes had drifted to the mirror behind the bar, where the faint reflection of his own face stared back, lined, tired, but alive. The barkeep followed his gaze, and something in his expression changed. His lips parted slightly, color draining from his face. Christ, he whispered. You can't be. The stranger finally looked at him. Names don't matter much in a place like this. But the barkeep couldn't stop staring. They said you were dead, buried in the desert. The stranger picked up his glass. They said a lot of things. He finished the drink and set down the empty glass, just as the door swung open again. The sound of spurs filled the room, slow, deliberate. Then came a voice that was smooth and sharp as a knife. I hear we've got company. Mace Holloway strode in, long black coat flapping behind him, his revolver gleaming under the lantern light. He looked older than his legend, lines at the corners of his mouth, silver creeping into his hair, but his eyes were the same. Hard, hungry. Well, well, Mace said, looking the stranger over. Ain't every day we get a visitor who don't know his place. The stranger turned, calm as still water. Maybe the town forgot its own. A flicker of something crossed Mace's face. Curiosity, then something darker. You talk bold, old man. You got a name. The stranger met his gaze. Names don't matter much, he said again. Mace grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. You sound like somebody I used to know. Fella who thought he could outshoot me. He's dead now. The stranger's lips barely curved. Then maybe you didn't shoot straight enough. The saloon fell silent. Even the lamps seemed to dim. Mace's hand hovered over his gun, fingers twitching once. He studied the man long and hard, and for a breath, something close to fear flashed in his eyes. Then he laughed. You're a fool, Mace said. Right out by dawn. This town ain't got room for ghosts. He turned on his heel and walked out, his men following, their laughter fading into the night. The barkeep exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow. You're crazy, he whispered. He'll kill you by morning. The stranger dropped a few silver coins on the counter. Maybe. He pushed through the saloon doors and stepped out into the cool night. The street was empty. The moon hung low, painting the desert silver. Lanterns flickered on the porches, their light trembling in the wind. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled. He walked to the edge of the porch, boots sinking into the dust, and looked out toward the canyons beyond the town, the same canyons that had nearly become his grave. The desert was cold that night, the kind of cold that seeps through bone and memory alike. Elias Kane rode through it with his collar turned up, the wind whispering across the canyons like an old friend. Moonlight cast his shadow long and thin across the sand, ghosting beside him as if it, too, remembered what had been done here. Somewhere out there, buried under rock and time, lay the place where he had once died. He could still see it in his mind. The canyon walls painted red by sunset, the smell of gunpowder sharp as iron in his throat. He had been younger then, quicker, still foolish enough to believe that loyalty meant something among outlaws. Mace Holloway had been his brother in all but blood, a man he'd shared campfires and bullets with from Wyoming to the border. Together, they had built a gang that moved like a shadow across the frontier. They stole from the rich, or so they said, but greed doesn't know charity. The night of the gold raid had been their last ride together. They'd hit a mining convoy outside Carson's Bluff, smooth as clockwork, no witnesses, no mistakes. Elias remembered the sound of hooves, the weight of a sack of gold dust slung over his shoulder, and then gunfire. Not from the marshals. From behind. He turned just in time to see Mace's face lit by muzzle flash, eyes flat and empty. The bullet struck hard, first in his side, then his shoulder. He fell into the canyon, heard the laughter fade as his body rolled down the slope. They thought he'd die there. They even came down to bury him under the sand and shale. But the desert has its own plans. He'd woken 3 days later beneath a sky so bright it felt like judgment. Buzzards circled overhead. He crawled to water, fevered and bleeding, and somewhere between delirium and death, He made a promise. He didn't promise vengeance. He promised justice, the kind that came slow and sure, like the desert wind grinding stone into dust. Now, years later, that promise had brought him home. He reined his horse to a stop on a rise overlooking Dust Creek. Lanterns flickered faintly in the valley below, too few for a town once alive. He dismounted, boots crunching against the dry earth, and walked among a patch of graves on the outskirts. Wooden crosses leaned crookedly under the weight of wind and time. He knelt beside one, a small marker carved with the name Abigail Harper, age 10. Mace's men had burned her family's farm for refusing to pay protection. Elias brushed sand from the name with his gloved hand. "You'll sleep easier soon, little one," he murmured. A noise behind him made him rise fast, hand to his gun. But it wasn't danger. Just a horse's soft whinny and a woman's voice. "Don't shoot, mister. I mean no harm." She stepped into the moonlight, holding a lantern. Her face was pale from the chill, her hair tied back under a shawl. A rifle hung loose in her other hand, though she didn't raise it. "You shouldn't be out here," Elias said. "Neither should you," she replied. Her voice carried the steady calm of someone who had lived too long with fear to waste it on strangers. "You're the one who walked into the saloon today." He studied her a moment. "And who might you be?" "Clara Bishop. I run the mill house east of town. Least what's left of it." She hesitated. "I knew a man once who looked like you. Years ago, in a mining camp near the Santo Ridge. He saved my husband from a cave-in. You wouldn't be him, would you?" Elias didn't answer right away. The past had a way of finding him, no matter how far he rode. "Maybe," he said finally. "That man's gone now." Clara's gaze softened. "Then you'll need a place to rest, whoever you are. There's eyes everywhere in this town. Holloway's men won't rest till they sniff out who you are. Follow me." She led him through a back trail to a small homestead half swallowed by the desert. The barn leaned like an old drunk. The fence was broken in 3 places, but the lantern light spilling from the window was warm. Inside, the scent of hay and horses filled the air. She guided him to the loft. "You can bed down here for the night. My boy won't bother you. He's asleep." Elias nodded, removing his hat. "You shouldn't risk this." Clara met his eyes squarely. "Risk is all we've got left in Dust Creek. If you're who I think you are, maybe you're what this place has been waiting for." Later, when the wind had settled, she brought him stew and bread. They ate in quiet until she finally spoke again. "I remember the stories. The man they called Elias Kane. They said he could draw faster than a blink. Said he disappeared after Holloway took the gold. Folks say he's dead." "Maybe he is," Elias said. "But if he wasn't," she said softly, "he'd come back for Holloway." He looked up at her then. The lantern's glow caught the scars along his jaw, the faint tremor in his hand. "If he did, it wouldn't be for revenge," he said. "It'd be for peace." Clara watched him for a long time before nodding. Peace don't come cheap in these parts. The next morning, her son, Tommy, found Elias by the fence mending boards. The boy couldn't have been more than 10, all elbows and curiosity. "You a cowboy?" he asked, eyes wide. Elias smiled faintly. "Not anymore." "You got a gun," the boy said, staring at the Colt on his hip. "Mama says guns only bring trouble." "Depends who's holding it," Elias said. He took the pistol from its holster, unloaded it, and handed it to the boy. "Go on. Feel the weight." Tommy's eyes lit up as he gripped the handle. "It's heavy." "It's supposed to be," Elias said. "Reminds a man what he's carrying. A gun ain't for revenge, boy. It's for courage when the world forgets what's right." The boy nodded solemnly, handing it back. "Mama says this town forgot." "She's right," Elias said, reloading with quiet precision. "But the world remembers, even when people don't." That afternoon, whispers began to drift through Dust Creek like wildfire. A rider seen near the Bishop place. Someone digging at graves. An old man with a gray beard and the calm of a killer. The whispers grew teeth. "A ghost rides the valley again." Mace Holloway's men laughed at first, until one of their number didn't come back from the Ridge Patrol. Clara tried to convince Elias to leave before it was too late. You can't fight them alone. There's too many, and they'll burn everything trying to find you. Elias sat at her kitchen table, cleaning his revolver. They already burned everything worth losing, he said quietly. You don't have to do this, she pressed, voice trembling now. The people here, they've lived under fear too long. They won't rise up. They've forgotten how. He looked up from his work, eyes steady. Then maybe it's time someone reminded them. For a moment, neither spoke. The clock ticked. Outside, the wind pushed sand against the windows like a warning. Clara's hands shook as she reached for the lantern, adjusting the wick. If they find out who you are, they'll kill you. Let them try, he said. Later that night, after she'd gone to bed, Elias sat alone in the barn, the desert silence pressing close. He spread a small cloth on the table and laid out 6 bullets in a row. The metal glinted dull gold under the lamplight. One by one, he took a knife and carved into each shell, steady, deliberate, like a craftsman at prayer. Mace, Carver, Dot, Wes, Lyle, and the last one, the smallest, he held longest before carving a single word, Cain. He loaded the revolver slow, the click of each bullet locking into place echoing in the quiet barn. The sun rose hard over Dust Creek, burning the horizon into a white blaze. By morning, every man in the Holloway gang had heard the same whisper. Someone was hunting them, a ghost with a gray beard and a steady hand. They laughed at first, passing bottles and jokes, but their eyes stayed sharp on every shadow. By the second night, laughter was gone. Carver was the first to die. He was riding the canyon trail east of town, the wind howling between the red cliffs. He never saw the man waiting in the rocks above, still as stone. When Carver's horse stumbled at the bend, a single shot cracked across the canyon, echoing off the walls. The bullet struck his chest clean through, throwing him backward in the saddle. By the time his body hit the dirt, the shooter was gone, leaving only tracks that vanished into the dust. 2 days later, the Dodd brothers disappeared. They'd holed up in an old barn near the river, guarding crates of stolen grain. The night was quiet until the lanterns began to swing from a breeze that wasn't there. Then came the noise, boots on the roof, slow and deliberate. One brother ran out with his rifle raised, shouting into the dark. The first shot took him in the shoulder. The second silenced him for good. Inside, the other Dodd scrambled for the back door, only to find a revolver waiting for him in the lantern light. The man behind it didn't speak. He didn't need to. The barrel flashed once, and the barn fell silent except for the crackle of a dying flame. By dawn, the town woke to see buzzards circling east of the river. Rumors spread faster than the wind. Mace Holloway's men were being picked off, one by one. Some said it was the law. Others said the desert itself had come for them. But the old ones, the ones who remembered the heist, began to whisper another name. Elias Cain. Mace sat in the saloon, the air thick with smoke and nerves. His remaining men sat close, hands never far from their guns. He's dead, Mace growled, slamming his glass down. I buried him myself. Wes Finn, youngest of the lot, swallowed hard. Then who's killing us, Mace? Who's out there? Mace glared at him. Ghost stories don't scare me, boy. But if someone wants to play at being a legend, I'll give him a taste of real death. Outside, thunder grumbled across the plains, though no clouds filled the sky. The townsfolk kept their doors shut, but behind curtains they watched. They saw the stranger ride through town at dusk, stopping at the general store to buy a single box of cartridges. They saw him tip his hat to the preacher's widow. They saw him look up Main Street, eyes tracing every rooftop and alley like a man memorizing his battlefield. That night, Elias Cain stood on the ridge above Dust Creek, watching the lanterns flicker below. He'd spent years trying to bury the man he used to be. Now he understood there was no burying the truth. The ghosts would never rest until justice was done. By morning, the last trap had been laid. Mace's men guarded every corner, the saloon roof, the stable, the bridge by the river. They waited for the ghost to ride in, ready to drown him and lead. But the desert had taught Elias patience. He moved like wind, silent, unseen. The first fell before sunrise, a shot from the dark that shattered the peace. Another died when the church bell struck 10, his body slumping across the balcony. Panic spread through the gang like fire through dry grass. They shot at shadows, at wind, at their own fear. When Wes Finn ran for his horse, Elias stepped from the smoke, revolver drawn but steady. Wes froze, face pale. "You ain't real," he stammered. Elias looked at him, voice low and even. "Real enough to finish what you started." The gunfire echoed once more, and Dust Creek went still. By noon, only one man remained. Mace Holloway stood on the saloon porch, hands clenched around the revolver that had built his reputation. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. The wind tore at the loose posters on the wall behind him, making them flutter like dying wings. Across the street, the church bell began to toll 12. The townspeople came out then, drawn by the sound. They filled the porches and doorways, silent, waiting. The heat shimmered off the street like a mirage. And then Elias Kane walked out from between the buildings, hat low, dust rising around his boots. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sounds were the creak of signs and the whisper of wind. Mace's fingers twitched near his gun. "You should have stayed buried," he said finally, his voice hard but trembling at the edges. Elias stopped in the middle of the street. His shadow stretched long behind him. "You should have dug deeper," he replied. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The words carried on the wind like prophecy. Mace spat into the dust. "All these years, and you come back for revenge?" Elias shook his head. "Not revenge. Reckoning." Mace laughed, though it sounded more like fear. "You think killing me changes what's been done? You think you can wash the blood off this town?" Elias's eyes never wavered. "It ain't about washing it. It's about stopping the spill." The clock struck 12. The world held its breath. A tumbleweed rolled between them, crossing the empty space, like fate itself. The light caught on their guns, two glints of silver under the merciless sun. Mace drew first. He was fast, faster than most men alive, but not faster than Elias Kane. Two shots cracked in perfect rhythm. The first missed Elias by an inch, shattering the whiskey bottle on the post beside him. The second found its mark square in Mace's chest. The outlaw staggered back, eyes wide in disbelief, his revolver slipping from his hand. The sound echoed across the valley, bouncing off the canyon walls like thunder from heaven. Mace fell to his knees, clutching at the spreading red on his shirt. "You can't be alive," he gasped. Elias stepped closer, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat. "The desert don't bury what it still owns." Mace tried to lift his gun again, but his hand was shaking too hard. "You were my brother," he rasped. Elias looked down at him, the silence between them heavy with years of dust and betrayal. "You were my mistake." Mace's eyes lost their fire then, his body slumping into the dirt. The street went still. For a long time, no one moved. Then Elias holstered his gun. His hand didn't shake. The wind swept through the street, carrying with it the scent of gunpowder and redemption. He turned away, walking past the bodies, past the wide-eyed townsfolk who stared like they'd seen a ghost step out of legend. Someone whispered, "It's him, Elias Kane." No one cheered. No one spoke. They only watched as he reached the edge of town, pausing by the church steps. The preacher's widow stood there, holding her shawl tight around her shoulders. She met his gaze and gave a single nod. He returned it, quiet and solemn, then walked on. Behind him, Dust Creek began to breathe again. Men came out of hiding. Women stepped from porches. Children peeked from doorways. The silence broke into murmurs, then relief. The curse that had hung over them for a decade was lifted, though they knew it had come at a price. Elias rode out slow, his horse's hooves stirring the dust of the street that bore his name once more. The sun blazed behind him, turning the world to gold. He didn't look back. Some said he vanished into the canyons again, that he became part of the desert, watching over the town he'd freed. Others swore they saw him years later, sitting quiet in a border saloon, his hat pulled low, eyes lost in memory. 3 days passed before the law reached Dust Creek. Sheriff Amos Tully rode in slow, his horse limping and his eyes squinting against the heat haze that rose from the earth like smoke. What he found was not the town he remembered. The saloon doors hung open. The streets were quiet, Too quiet, save for the whisper of the wind through broken fences. But the fear that once stained the air was gone. Bodies had already been buried. The Holloway gang, every last one of them, lay under the hard soil just beyond the churchyard, their names carved without honor on rough wood. Folks had done the work themselves, not out of respect, but because they didn't want to give the vultures the satisfaction. Tully dismounted, dusted his coat, and walked down Main Street. The people he passed didn't speak, only nodded in that wary way of souls who had seen something they couldn't quite explain. "Who did this?" he asked the barkeep at the Silver Spur. The man just shook his head. "No one knows, Sheriff. They say a stranger came through. An old gun hand. Quiet sort." Tully frowned. "Name? No one ever asked. But after it was done, some say they heard it whispered, like the wind said it itself, Elias Kane." The sheriff looked down at his boots, scuffing the dirt. "That's not possible. Kane's been dead near 10 years. The barkeep poured him a drink, hands trembling slightly. "Then I reckon the desert gave him back." That night, as the lawman filed his report by lantern light, he found himself staring out the window toward the distant canyons. The sky glowed faintly with the aftertaste of sunset, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, a rider, solitary, cutting through the dunes toward the horizon. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Clara Bishop watched the same horizon from her porch. The town was alive again, in a quiet way. The blacksmith's hammer rang through the morning. Children played where men once drew guns. Life had returned, fragile but real. Yet Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the empty trail leading west. She found the note tucked beneath her door that morning, pinned by a single bullet. The paper was rough, written in a hand both careful and weary. "For every man I killed, I gave one life back to Dust Creek." She read it twice, fingers trembling, before pressing it to her chest. When she looked up, the wind caught the brim of a hat hanging from a nail on her porch, the same battered, dust-streaked hat Elias Kane had worn. It swayed in the breeze, like a ghost waving farewell. Her son came out, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Mama, where'd he go?" Clara smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "Where he belonged, Tommy. The desert called him home." The boy looked down the road, shading his eyes from the glare. "Will he come back?" She didn't answer. The wind did instead, carrying with it the faint jingle of spurs, distant, fading, but there. By evening, the story had grown. They said he rode south, following the river through the Badlands. Others swore they saw him headed toward the mountains, chasing the sunset. No one agreed on which way he went, but everyone agreed on one thing. He didn't look back. A week later, Sheriff Tully followed the trail himself. He found hoof prints leading through the canyon pass, then disappearing into shifting sand. Near an old mesquite tree, something caught his eye, a half-buried cross. He brushed away the dust, revealing weathered wood carved with uneven letters. Elias Kane, died 1872. The sheriff stood there a long time, hat in hand, the wind whispering around him. He couldn't tell if it was a grave or a reminder. The ground was dry, undisturbed, like no one had touched it in years. But a single horseshoe print nearby was fresh. When he rode back to town, he didn't tell anyone what he'd seen. Some truths belonged to the land. In the weeks that followed, Dust Creek changed. Folks stopped looking over their shoulders. The saloon reopened, but laughter no longer carried fear behind it. The preacher's widow lit candles every night, one for each soul lost, and one for the man who'd brought peace back to them. The desert wind became gentler somehow, its whistle softer, as though it, too, had been set free. Clara kept the note folded in a Bible beside her bed. Sometimes she'd read it aloud to Tommy, who'd grown obsessed with stories of gunslingers and ghosts. He wasn't a ghost, she'd tell him. He was just a man who kept his word. But when the boy went to sleep, she'd sit by the window and whisper into the night, "Rest easy, Elias. Dust Creek won't forget." Years passed, and new travelers came through, drawn by tales of the ghost who rode out of the desert. They'd stand in the saloon, squinting at the bullet holes in the wall, at the old piano, still missing one ivory key. "They say he was faster than lightning." One would start. "They say he was already dead when he came back," another would add. And the barkeep, older now, would smile behind his glass and say, "Maybe both." On nights when the wind rose just right, carrying sand through the alleys and over the rooftops, you could still hear the faint echo of hooves. Some said it was the storm. Others said it was Elias Kane, riding the edges of time, keeping watch. One summer evening, long after Clara's boy had become a man, a stranger stopped by the Bishop homestead. He was quiet, polite, carrying a small journal and a thirst for old stories. Clara, gray-haired but still sharp-eyed, poured him tea and listened as he asked about the legend. Was he real? The man asked. This gunslinger they call the ghost of Dust Creek. She smiled, eyes turning toward the fading light. Real as the wind, she said. Real as the pain he left behind. But legends ain't about what's real. They're about what's remembered. The stranger nodded, closing his journal. What happened to him in the end? Clara took a deep breath, the smell of dust and sage filling her lungs. The desert took him back, like it does everything. That night, after the stranger rode off, she stood on her porch again, the same hat still hanging there after all these years. The brim had frayed, the leather cracked by sun and wind. Yet somehow, it still looked alive, like it was waiting for the right breeze to carry it away. She thought she saw him then, just for a heartbeat, riding far out near the rim of the canyon. The outline was faint, blurred by heat and distance, but the way he sat the saddle, the tilt of his hat, it couldn't have been anyone else. She blinked, and he was gone, far beyond Dust Creek, as twilight bled into night. A lone rider crossed the desert plain. The sky burned deep crimson, the kind of red that marked endings and beginnings alike. His horse moved slow, steady, unhurried. Behind him stretched a trail of dust that caught the sun's last light, turning gold before fading into shadow. He didn't glance back at the world he'd left. His face was calm, eyes fixed on the horizon. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the desert's breath against his skin. Somewhere ahead lay nothing but open land and silence, the kind of silence a man could rest in. As the sun dipped below the edge of the world, the desert swallowed his shape, turning man into myth once more. Some said he was a ghost. Others said justice just took a long time to ride home. And when the night came, the wind carried his name one last time across the canyons, soft, reverent, and eternal. Before the desert, faithful keeper of all things lost and remembered, took Elias Kane back into its arms. Under the blood-red sky, the legend rode on, fading into dust and eternity.